Welcome to the Dr. America Show here on the We Act Radio Network. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. Thanks so much for joining us again. So this is Easter week. We've got a lot going on. Lots been happening in the news, and I'm excited that you guys are here to join us. Lots to cover. Big week in the news. Congress is out on recess, but there were a lot of policy developments, both federally and in a lot of state houses across the country, and we're going to get to all that. First, I wanted to take a moment and respond to some people who, I guess they caught a feeling about something I posted on the Dr. America Facebook page from our friends at the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. The Brady Campaign, does fantastic work, and they partnered with the American Academy of Pediatrics to develop the Ask campaign. The Ask campaign has been around for a while, and it encourages parents to ask if somebody else who's taking care of their child if there is a gun in the home, because their child is going to be spending time there, either for a play date, or if this is somebody who's going to be babysitting the kid for a little bit. It's just really to encourage parents to ask other people who are going to take on the responsibility of caring for their child if there is a gun in the home. And the Ask campaign has been around for a couple of years. We covered it on this program a few episodes ago. And what we've learned is that it really does work. And I can tell you that from my own clinical experience, the Ask campaign has been fantastic. And there have been a number of times where I have had moms come back and tell me at doctor's visits, it's funny that you encouraged me to talk about guns with, my child's grandparents and my child's father, because, I didn't realize that that the child's father's brother, that is the child's uncle, was temporarily staying at the father's home and had a gun in his duffel bag and did not tell anybody about it until people started having just questions about, hey, does anybody own a gun? How are you storing it? Where is it stored? And it actually created this conversation of safety for this family. And, as a pediatrician, I can tell you that there are tons of my other colleagues who have tons of these other stories. So we know that this Ask campaign works. It's community-based. We like to kind of give parents that empowerment to take control of their child's safety. And recently, the Brady campaign put together some marvelous media to really kind of reactivate some things in the campaign and to extend it once again to some new media circles. And it's great material. And if you guys haven't seen it yet, definitely Google it, check it out. It's worth sharing. It's interesting that this, caught some responses, on the Facebook page. And then, we've got a couple of messages here at We Act Radio about, why are you guys, being so caught up with guns and telling parents to ask about guns when, you have all these kids dying of, chemical ingestions and swimming pools, and they listed off and showed, these statistics that showed that, there were more kids being injured by chemicals in swimming pools and other kinds of, ingesting things. And, I'm not going to argue about those statistics. Yes, chemicals have hurt more children than guns. And it's for a similar and familiar reason that children are especially young children are by nature curious. They're going to explore their world, their little environment. And when they find something that is not properly stored, that is dangerous, whether that's a gun or a chemical, dangerous things can happen. Kids can get hurt. And I'm not going to argue about that, that chemicals are somehow, less dangerous than guns. Yes, chemicals are dangerous. But what I want to point out is that we seem to have a very different conversation about protecting children from chemicals than we do about protecting kids from guns. And it's worth actually kind of looking at this because over the recent couple of months, we've had a great opportunity to do this compare and contrast. Okay, so let's take, for instance, those laundry detergent packets. I don't know if you guys have seen these. They're called pods by some of the detergent companies. Maybe you've seen them. They're like either bright blue or bright green. And there are these, like, it's supposed to be the perfect amount of detergent for running a load of laundry, and it's all in this little packet like pod, and it's like this large squishy gumball style thing. It's a new development from the detergent companies. Now, as it turns out, that just in 2014, the American Association of Poison Control Centers reported that 11,700 children under the age of 5 were exposed to chemicals in these laundry detergent packets. And I mean, these things look like giant pieces of candy. And so these kids were suffering of all kinds of things, coughing, choking. Some of the kids have gotten, the detergent made it so far down their respiratory passage that they ended up with these horrible inflammations and scarring and damage to, their lungs and their trachea, and it's really terrible. And some of the kids have had damage done on their esophagus and stomach, and it's terrible. Kids have been horribly injured by these things. And, a lot of research and statistics, were gathered together, and they were presented by pediatricians, parents, consumer protection groups, other kinds of safety advocates. These groups and these concerned citizens basically took what they knew, took the science, the data, all their research, and they brought it to Congress. And they said, this is really serious. We have not really seen, a particular chemical, cause this much damage this quickly since it entered the market. And we're really worried about this. Now, in response, Senator Durbin on the Senate side and Congresswoman Jackie Speer on the House side introduced legislation in their respective chambers of Congress, and it was called the Detergent Poisoning and Child Safety Act. Okay, that legislation is now kind of, making its way through committees, and it hasn't been turned into law yet. And neither side of the Congress has passed it. But I want to kind of point out several things about this entire story which make it so different than the way that we approach guns, and why I feel that the Brady campaign needs to be given a whole lot of slack on how they are encouraging parents to have conversations about guns. Coming back to the detergent thing. Okay. First off, we have public health and medical researchers who could actually collect data on injuries by a specific chemical. They were able to actually go through the Poison Control Center data, and which had been gathered and collected and organized. They were able to sift through that and figure out, like the age of the children, what kind of injuries they had suffered, what caused those injuries. They were able to do a lot of very specific research so that they would have the best quality data to answer questions about how serious of a problem is this, what are the consequences, and to really kind of look at, like, what could be some causes for why this is happening. Are there things that are similar to other chemical injuries that we're learning from? So there's all this data available, and researchers are able to do their job without any kind of interference. This is nowhere near what we have going on with gun violence. There is no such kind of thing going on right now with gun violence where you can actually have public health experts and medical researchers get together and go through carefully collected data, sift through it to kind of figure out, like, no, none of that stuff is there for guns with the ease and without the interference that we see with these kinds of injuries happening from the chemical world. Okay. So one huge difference is the interference on research that the chemical industry doesn't seem to really get in the way of people trying to learn more about how detergent is hurting our kids. But the gun world seems to really get in the way of this kind of public health research almost every step of the way. That's a huge compare and contrast point, number one. Number two, okay, look at what happens when these concerned groups reach out to Congress. The groups that reached out were the American Academy of Pediatrics. So they're one of the groups that reached out. Obviously, these are pediatricians who are really concerned about these kinds of injuries happening to kids. They actually have a council at the AAP called the AAP Council on Injury, Violence, and Poison Prevention. I mean, this is a specialized group of doctors who actually were looking at the data, really concerned about this, and they were able to learn things like I was pointing out before about the kinds of children who are being, affected by this, and they found that children younger than 3 years old accounted for 73% of the cases. I mean, like, that's actually a pretty specific number. It's a pretty, it reflects, their professional work on research and looking at data and trying to understand who are the kids who are most at risk for, getting hurt by chemicals that are in all of our homes. Okay, so you have the American Academy of Pediatrics, right? You've got other folks from the Consumers Union, the people who publish the consumer reports, those guys. They're able to get together, present this important information to Congress. And notice how you don't see the people over at Tide or Gain or Arm & Hammer or All. They don't go up to Congress and, they don't go and demand an interview at Fox News saying, like, these pediatricians and these consumer advocates are a bunch of communists, like, anti-patriot, threats to American freedom. Like, no, you don't see that at all. The industry actually let the conversation happen in a civil way. You're actually finding that when people are concerned about detergent hurting kids, they can go to Congress, have a conversation, and not have their patriotism questioned or undermined because of their concern as pediatricians, parents, and consumers. They're able to have the conversation. Again, big contrast point from like how we have conversations about guns, where these same groups try to talk about gun injuries, and all of a sudden it's like they are a threat to the Constitution. They're going to invite the UN to come and take away all the guns. I mean, and hysteria ensues and nothing productive happens. All right. So, I mean, that's, like the second, contrast point is that we're able to have the first contrast point was that, we could get research done. The second contrast point, we're able to have civil conversation between people who are experts and concerned citizens and members of Congress without everything falling apart into a big dramatic mess. All right. The third really big distinction point is that when you look at the Detergent, Poisoning, and Child Safety Act, this is the legislation that Senator Durbin and Congresswoman Spear introduced in their respective chambers of Congress. When you look at the legislation, what they're really trying to do is they're trying to work with the safety agencies that already exist. They're looking at the Consumer Product Safety Commission. These are the folks where they are responsible for looking at a huge number of household products, and they're the people who are able to, come up with suggestions and rules and mandatory regulations about, okay, if you're a, over-the-counter medication company, then you need to, package your medications in such and such a container with a child-proof cap. They're able to they're able to talk about things like what are the chemicals that go into paint that goes on toys. They actually are the folks that you can report problems with when you have like a problem with cribs, baby furniture, child furniture, things that seem to fall apart or things that seem to like end up, getting damaged easily, and then like the kids end up getting hurt. The Consumer Product Safety Commission actually does the hard work of figuring out, okay, how much of the problem is the problem of the product? How much of the problem is the manufacturer? How much of the problem is that maybe the manufacturer didn't tell the consumer how to store the product safely? Things like this are important work that is being done by this commission, but and all that the Detergent, Poisoning, and Child Safety Act is trying to do is make some of the same rules that already apply for things like dishwashing liquids and, cleaning products and how they're labeled, how they're colored, how they're marketed. All that kind of stuff is basically they're basically taking the rules that already exist for these products, the rules that we know work to keep people safe. This commission is now going to be given a chance to look at things like these detergent packets and ask, okay, like some of these rules, do they apply here? Can they work here? Will they protect children if we do the same kinds of things here? Or do we need to treat these detergent packets very differently? Notice how, like, it's amazing that we can continue to have these products in our homes, right? It's not like you saw the laundry detergent world just completely disappear. It's not like all of us are walking around with stinky clothes because the laundry detergent world had to answer the Consumer Product Safety Commission and their whole business model fell apart. No, nothing like that happened. But you know what? This is how the gun world behaves if they ever have a question made about, hey, you know that rifle that like just fell over in that one closet and shot through the door and hurt someone? That seems to be happening a lot with that particular kind of rifle. Do you think maybe the manufacturer, you even try to raise this question and all hell breaks loose, all drama like starts to unfold, and you would think that, that the entire capitalist world is going to come falling to its knees because we dared ask a simple safety question that would save lives and stop people from getting injured. This is why we're able to have these conversations about detergent, about toys, about furniture, about all these other products, and it doesn't seem to ever really make the news. There's no drama there. We're able to do the research, we're able to have civil conversations with policymakers, and we're able to take action and get people to the table so that they can work together and start solving problems. There's nothing really dramatic here, and maybe this is why the media doesn't cover it a whole lot. But don't think for a second that the health advocates are not paying attention to these issues. As I was pointing out before, the AAP has an entire council that is devoted just to injury and poison prevention. They have, when you look at like the material that every child health organization has put out in the last couple of months, they've been talking about these detergent packets. They've been really wanting people to know that Congress is working on this act, that there are things that they can do as concerned citizens, as parents, as people who take care of children, that if you care about this issue, you can get involved. All of these things are happening out there. If you only seem to ever pay attention because, somebody told you to ask about guns in another person's home, if that's the only time you think doctors care, then maybe it's not really the doctor's problem. Maybe it's that you need to really kind of look at how you pay attention to the news and how you pay attention to child injury prevention. Because we are there. We are delivering these messages. We are putting our information out in the public square. It's all over the internet. You Google any of what I'm talking about, and you'll find tons and tons of information. It's all available at your fingertips. And we're there. But what's not there is the drama. You're not going to really find a whole lot of people belly aching about like the destruction of the Constitution, the coming and rise of communism. You won't find any of that. If that's what you're looking for, then yeah, maybe you should stick to the gun violence, conversations and conflicts, because that seems to be full of all this hysteria. If you really want to like learn more about protecting kids, come and check these things out. Come and check out the AAP's Council on Injury Prevention and Poison Prevention. You'll find a lot of great material, a lot of ways to help the children in your life. But if you're looking for drama, I'm sorry, that's just not the place to go. So I know that was a very long response to a couple of people on Facebook, but I just wanted to, defend a lot of us child health advocates for the work that we've been doing to protect kids from poisonings, and that we're not ignoring it. We're actually doing amazing work. And if it didn't get the same kind of coverage as our, gun work, well, you've heard my reasons why that is. All right, so next thing we got to cover and talk about is actually a pretty serious condition that is it seems to be spreading around the country. And as a physician, I feel I got to warn you guys about it. I think it's like my duty. It's called bigotophilia. I don't know if you guys have heard about this before, but the most recent case seemed to happen in Indiana, where Governor Pence passed this Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And, it's like a pretty dramatic case of bigotophilia. And, I think that what it is that, you can recognize the symptoms and you can recognize somebody who's suffering from it because, when they do like a signing ceremony for these kinds of pieces of legislation, they seem to have like some really like, prominent bigots in the picture with them, and these are the people that they write these policies for. They want to stay in their good graces. Our friends over at the gay lesbian alliance and the Anti-Defamation League, the folks over at GLAAD, they did a great job of actually showing this photograph where, you've got Governor Mike Pence is at the signing ceremony, right? And, when you look at the photo, like, he says that this is not about anti-gay discrimination, and that's not what the intent of all this is. And that's another symptom of bigotophilia, is that, your words start to not make sense, even though you know what you intended to do, like what you do and what you say don't quite match up. That's bigotophilia for you. But yeah, what's interesting is that they have a photo of Mike Pence at the signing ceremony on their on the website. And the way that that he is, very comfortable with some bigots are the other people who are in the photo with him. You've got Micah Clark, who, and I'm quoting the work here from the folks over at GLAAD, saying that Micah Clark believes homosexuality is a treatable disorder. He publicly raged against a lesbian high school student over a prom tuxedo. This is how this guy spends his time, is that he wants to publicly rage against a lesbian high school student over a prom tuxedo. Then you have Kurt Smith, and you got to look at this picture because Kurt Smith is doing one of these things where you can tell this is a grown man standing on tippy toes, just dying to be in this photo. He's straining his neck, trying to look over the dude in front of him. I mean, it's sad when you see a grown up acting like this. But anyway, Kurt Smith equates homosexuality with bestiality and adultery. He helped write the bill. Okay, so bigotophilia here. All right. And then the guy standing almost directly behind Mike Pence, this is Eric Miller, all right? He distributed a fear flyer falsely claiming that pastors could be jailed for preaching against homosexuality after the same-sex marriage, after same-sex marriage passed. So basically, when Indiana was told that, they got to recognize same-sex marriage, this guy, Eric Miller, hands out these flyers saying that pastors could be jailed if they preached against homosexuality. Of course, there's nothing true about that. You can preach against it all you want, and you'll just be another case of bigotophilia, but you're not going to go to jail for it. But yeah, no, bigotophilia. I mean, Indiana's not alone. This is as I was saying, it's spreading across the country. We seem to be you've got, guys like Mike Pence, Jeb Bush, all these folks falling over themselves, trying to say that they're not anti-gay, but they support this this Religious Freedom Restoration Act and things like it in all of these states. And it's a serious condition because bigotophilia, what it really tries to do is that it tries to create a system where we have second-class citizens among us for no other fault than because of who they love and who they are and how they identify themselves. That is what, that's the real threat of bigotophilia spreading the way that it is that it creates this second-class citizenship. And I look at things like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and what scares me as a healthcare provider, and this is, a little bit of the joking aside, what scares me as a healthcare provider is that, things like this are trying to are trying to give encouragement to the ignorant. It gives encouragement to the ignorant in the sense that, let's say you are a pharmacist who believes that HIV and AIDS is God's punishment on homosexuality. That's a belief that has been there since, AIDS emerged in the 1980s. It was wildly popular at first. It has that notion has shrunk down, but is still there among some, very, very conservative, bigoted, ignorant people. But let's say you're a pharmacist who happens to have that belief. You could actually deny somebody of their HIV medication because you feel that you feel you don't want to get in the way of God's punishment on this gay person. and you would be protected by the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Let's say you're an EMT and you're called to an emergency and, it's house is on fire, and you decide that you can't bring it upon yourself to offer first aid to somebody who is homosexual, and that your religious conscience, keeps you from doing that. Again, Religious Freedom Restoration Act is probably going to come to your rescue. There was an incident in Michigan, not Indiana, but in Michigan, where a similar act is actually up for possible signing. Governor hasn't decided yet which way he's going to go, and I'm hoping that he's paying attention to what's happening in Indiana right now. But no, back up in Michigan, there was a pediatrician who refused to care for a child because that child had lesbian parents. Had these two women brought their child to this pediatrician's office, were kept waiting an unusual amount of time, and then that pediatrician's colleague came into the room saying that she was going to be taking care of the kid, not the original pediatrician with whom this family had the appointment. And instead, that pediatrician had given these people a note saying that, after much prayer and contemplation, she decided that she could not be the healthcare provider for this child because she disagreed with the lifestyle of the parents, and that her religious convictions, did not allow her to be this kid's doctor, even though she is a pediatrician. This is her job, and this is her training. Somebody like that could be protected under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. What I find so offensive about this is that it actually has nothing to do with religious freedom. Like, this is outright bigotry hiding under, religious freedom and religious protection, and it actually sullies the good name of people of faith. I am not a Christian myself, but I've had the pleasure and honor of working with a number of Christians on things like health reform, things like Medicaid, chip expansion, and a variety of health issues. And what I've always been moved by is how they seem to have a very good handle on what the true gospel is of doing right by people who are in need and regardless of who they are, like if there's suffering in the world, these folks look to their, religious conscience and their spiritual faith as a source of strength and purpose and guidance to do good work. And that to me is what, is the role of religion in our lives, is that it really is there to, keep us strong during times when this gets challenging. I know that I have turned to my faith as a Hindu and as somebody who, follows more Eastern traditions. I know that I've turned to my faith for a sense of purpose, for a sense of strength whenever I've felt, really just lost and bewildered about, how on earth is there just this much suffering in this one family, and and all those things that, providers go through. Why is this happening? I feel like, religion has been there in a variety of forms to offer some counsels, to offer some guidance, and then to send me back into the struggle and to do my best for the people that I am serving. And to me, I think like that is really like religion at its best. And when I see things like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, I kind of feel like, what exactly are you trying to restore? Because it certainly doesn't sound like you're trying to restore the best of the American faith experience. It sounds like you're trying to restore something that we should really have rooted out a long time ago, but seems to be this like lingering cancer on American society that seems to, like hold up religious scripture as an excuse to be a bigot, as an excuse to be cruel, as an excuse to be discriminatory, and to then, I guess, somehow absolve yourself from the hate. Like, there's things about this that really just, gross me out to my core. I'm very proud of the people of Indiana for standing up and advocating I want people to what we can learn from what's going on in Indiana is a couple of things. One is that like it really does make a difference when you get out into the street and you demonstrate. When you pick up the phone and you call your elected official, when you decide that you're going to write, tweet, when you decide to to give up silence and to actually raise your voice, guys like Mike Pence have to now get back on, TV, and he embarrasses himself. I mean, like, the man suffers from bigotophilia. I mean, like, I guess this is like where, his words and his inability to hear, reporters' questions properly. I mean, it happens. I mean, this guy was asked, okay, so they asked if the law would have forced, this is that religious, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. If it would have, without it, would a Christian florist be forced to provide flowers for the wedding of a gay or lesbian couple? A reporter asked this, right? And the Governor Pence's response is like, of course, a non-response to this reporter. He says, "What courts have found without exception over the past 20 plus years is that the state has a compelling interest in combating discrimination, and I support that interpretation. I believe in my heart of hearts that no one should be discriminated against because of who they are, who they love, or what they believe." Now, the thing is that at the same time, he's not really telling, this, hypothetical Christian florist. And mind you, there's a number of, actual businesses that are not hypothetical, like small businesses that, they said that we don't want to bake cakes for gay weddings. We don't want to, do, floral arrangements. I mean, there are people who have been vocal about. What's sad, and I know that this is the bigotophilia talking in people like Governor Mike Pence, is that they're not telling those small business owners that, that closely held belief that you have is wrong, and it has nothing to do with your religion. You just don't like gay people. Similar to how people who owned lunch counters back in the day did not like the idea of serving a person of color. And you have to get over it. You have to move on. You have to get with the rest of society. Because the big business community has been responding in really fascinating ways. I was surprised to see Eli Lilly, of all people, the drug company, weighed in on this because they've got, some major offices there in Indiana. You've got the NCAA that came out saying that, they've got some serious concerns about this. You have whole states and cities that are boycotting Indiana, like San Francisco and Connecticut, both, had their elected officials come out saying that they're boycotting the state of Indiana. And honestly, this kind of pressure, only happens if we stand up for each other. And that's the biggest learning point I think we have of this. And it's fascinating that this is what's happening during Easter week because, right before these guys break for Easter, this is what they decide to work on. They decide to work on something hateful, towards, our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender brothers and sisters. And what I am so moved by is that everyday citizens actually decided that they were going to really do what Jesus did and stand up for the people who were otherwise going to be downtrodden. And I commend, average citizens for taking to the streets, raising their voice, and making their support known, because that is how that's the prescription against bigotophilia, is that you gotta raise your voice. You gotta, make your presence felt and really let folks like, guys like Governor Mike Pence, let them know that this is not okay. It's Easter week. I think, the other element of I think doing what Jesus did is to kind of look at some of the other things that he taught his disciples, right before, the crucifixion. And he spent a lot of time talking about poverty and how to take care of the sick and the needy. And he didn't say anything about gay people. So it's tragic that these guys spent this much time working on this when, in fact, like, I think Jesus gave them a whole ton of homework on like what to do about poor people. And that seems to still not be getting done. Last week, the House passed a budget which is pretty tragic. I mean, there's no way that it's going to become law because even the Senate version, which is very similar, is devastating for poor people. But it really does kind of fail the challenges that I think that Jesus would want us to answer about how to take care of the poor, how to take care of the sick, how to take care of the needy. And just to kind of run through some of my biggest concerns with the budget as it currently stands from the House side, and it looks like the Senate side is going to be very similar to this. There's a couple of like key provisions that I'm really, really worried about. First off, they're pretty much going to take SNAP food stamps and turn it into a block grant. I'm going to get into like what a block grant means in just a little bit. But when it comes to food stamps, their plan would, slash, food stamps by so much, by basically $125 billion. And what is so devastating about that is that there's 11 to 14 million people who are now going to lose food stamps. And the average family that continues to keep their food stamps is going to be losing, so much money per meal, to the point where I don't see how the food stamp is going to accomplish its mission of alleviating hunger in America. So the slashing of food stamps in order to, quote unquote, fix the deficit is just devastating. Another really, really concerning, tragic, scary element of the House budget is that it plans to take Medicaid and turn it into a block grant, which really just slashes about $700-something billion out of the program. And they're calling it a savings. But honestly, what it is that it's actually just a huge threat to the lives of millions of children and elderly people and disabled people across the country. So let me explain why block grants are just this, scary and threatening of a problem. Okay, so the way that the current Medicaid system works is that it's this partnership. It's this buddy system between the federal government and the state government. And the federal government pitches in a bit, the state government pitches in a bit, and now that state has a Medicaid program to run for citizens living in that state. And what happens during, let's say really bad financial times, like a recession, let's say something happens to the state where all of a sudden you have a huge surge in poor people, Hurricane Sandy, a real thing. You can have these times when a state's Medicaid program needs to come to the rescue of a lot of people, and it's kind of unexpected. And under the current system, the federal government is able to give more money to Medicaid during times like that. They're able to increase their funding support, help out that state because the state is showing an increased need, and the Medicaid program survives and thrives and is able to come to the rescue of people who have suddenly fallen on hard times like the ones that I'm describing. That's the current system. That's the way things currently work, okay? And what the block grant does is basically takes that all and wipes that out. And what it does instead is that it says that the federal government now under a block grant would say, state, you get a fixed amount of money. There you go. That's it. Nothing else. Now the state has to take this fixed amount of money, and some people are saying that, now the state has more flexibility with how it's going to spend this money. Mind you, in the old system, the state always had that flexibility. They were always able to do what they had to do to make Medicaid work for their state. But now the state has to take this fixed box of money and make their Medicaid program work. Now, let's say another recession hits. Let's say another Superstorm Sandy comes along and you suddenly have people who are in real serious need, people who suddenly became homeless, people who really are in desperate need of some support, some healthcare services. Now the state can't go back to the federal government and ask for additional support because that's not allowed in a block grant system. You can see how now this Medicaid program is under serious trouble because of no fault of the state or the people, but basically a stingy federal government is going to turn a blind eye, a deaf ear, and a cold heart to people who are in serious need of health care. This is why I've always opposed block grants. I feel that this is, a major threat to something that isn't broken. This isn't something that needs repair. There are tons of other little reforms that can happen in Medicaid, and right now we've got the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services that does tremendous work researching how to really get the best out of a dollar when it's spent in Medicare and Medicaid, and they do ingenious work. They do great work, and we are getting better at spending that money and getting more and more value out of it. We don't need this block grant. So that was another concern that I have about turning Medicaid into block grants. Another one, and I'm going to have to ask our guest when he comes on, when we talk to him about this, but basically it turns Medicare into Obamacare, but it repeals Obamacare. Let me explain what I'm trying to understand here. Okay, so, and we'll start with Obamacare, right? So Obamacare basically is that the government will help you in the federal exchange with buying health insurance, okay, if you cannot afford it, and it will give you a little bit of support to afford the health insurance plan that's being offered. And you can shop around for a plan that kind of suits what you need and all of that, right? This is the way that the federal exchanges part of Obamacare works. And a lot of people like it. A lot of people, like we've covered before, are getting tons of help with their health insurance. Now, the budget coming out of the House gets rid of Obamacare. It says that it wants to completely dismantle that. But it wants to do that to Medicare. Basically, it would take Medicare, and it tells current seniors that if you want the old-fashioned Medicare, the way that it's always been, if you want that option, you can have that option. But then it's really trying to push seniors into this privatized model where you would get this thing called premium support, which is sort of like a voucher, and you can go and shop for health insurance. And I can tell you right now, if you are a senior citizen with, trying to shop for health insurance, that is a whole other ballgame because, aging brings with it a ton of other, medical conditions and need for healthcare services. And it is much more expensive to get private insurance than it is to just, than it is to do Medicare as it currently exists. But the weird thing that I don't get from a policy perspective is that if the way that Obamacare worked to get people private insurance is how you want seniors to get their insurance, why get rid of Obamacare? It sounds like you wanted to expand Obamacare to cover seniors also. It's a bad idea. It's not the way that you're going to save any money, and it's really just a bigger gift to the insurance industry. But I just don't get it. I just don't get how you get rid of that part of Obamacare, but then you tell seniors that you're going to make them do the exact same thing. Hopefully our guests will have an explanation, and that actually brings me to what got defeated in the House last week, and that was the People's Budget. It was developed by the Progressive Caucus. They are a fantastic group of congressmen and women who are pretty much from the Democratic Party. They represent the best of progressive values. They are the people who really championed the public option when we were first fighting for health reform. It was my pleasure to get to know a lot of the people who work on the Progressive Caucus Committee and a lot of the work that they try to do to make healthcare more accessible, more expansive, and also just to do things that alleviate poverty, to do the things that work. And so I'm really excited to introduce you guys to my next guest, and that is Mike Darner. Okay, so just to tell you guys, I met Mike, years ago when I first moved to D.C., and at that time he was the legislative director for Congressman John Conyers, and I got to know Mike pretty well because, at the time he was doing some work on health reform, but now Mike is serving as the executive director of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. The CPC consists of one United States Senator and 70 members of the United States House of Representatives and is the largest caucus within the House Democrats. It was established in 1991, and the CPC reflects the diversity, strength of the American people and seeks to give voice to the needs and aspirations of all Americans to build a more just and humane society. I'm really excited to introduce you guys to Mike. He's got like a world of expertise to offer about the people's budget and what amazing good it could do for the American people. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Sanjeev, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. So, I was really impressed with what I got to read about the people's budget. There was so many, fascinating things about the policy as far as like what it could do to help poor and struggling Americans. And but I kind of want to like rewind back and go to the drawing board for this budget plan. What was the Progressive Caucus's vision for America's struggling families when they developed this budget? What were the goals?
Sure. So just a little bit of background. The Congressional Progressive Caucus has been offering a alternative budget every year for the past 5 years, and this year was our fifth budget, which again we call the People's Budget, and the subtitle of A Raise for America. And one of the reasons the caucus offers this budget each year is to provide an alternative vision for the direction that America could go in, an alternative vision and a series of bold policies that could address some of the key challenges that are facing Americans. And as you know, and I'm sure your listeners know, I think the number one thing, and the way the caucus feels, the number one challenge that's facing Americans today is rising income inequality and a systemic sense of economic insecurity. There's a squeeze happening right now. We call it the middle class or the working class squeeze, and it's basically a situation where over the past 30 years, traditionally when people's productivity increased, as they worked harder, they got paid more. Their wages increased as well, and that happened all the way up until the 1970s. And then at some point, something changed, and people continued to be productive and continued to work hard, but their wages stopped increasing, and we've seen that trend sort of accelerate over the past decade. And in fact, over the past decade, people's average wages have remained stagnant and even sometimes decreased. At the same time, the building blocks of the American dream, the things that people count on to live a happy and fulfilled life, the access to education, access to housing, access to health care, all of these things have become more expensive.
And and these are these are fundamentals that you're talking about. You're not talking about people trying to live lifestyles of the rich and famous with caviar dreams and things. You're talking about the basics have gotten more expensive.
That's right. The key things that economists agree and policymakers agree are necessary to have basic economic security in your life. Again, education, housing, healthcare. These things are necessities. These things are not luxuries that only a few folks ought to be able to afford. So what the caucus did was basically look at that problem, look at that middle class and working class squeeze, and say, what are the key things that we can do from a federal perspective to address this incredibly troubling trend and the economic situation that's allowed this to occur, where people have this awful sense of insecurity when they open up their paycheck at the end of the month. They have like a sinking feeling in the pit of their stomach a lot of the time because they're not sure how they're going to be able to provide for themselves and their families.
Right, and how they're going to make it to the end of the next month.
Right.
So, I saw that the People's Budget has provisions to increase the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and the Child Care Credit, which I found it interesting that economists from different political ideologies, they all seem to agree that these are really powerful ways to lift poor families up. How does that work?
Sure, absolutely. The EITC and the CPC, as we call them, are incredibly powerful and important tax credits that basically incentivize low-wage workers to keep working, but also provides them with some real financial assistance so that they can provide for themselves and their families. Essentially, what happens is it's a credit that is given, and it's based on your income. And actually, the credit increases as you continue to work. Each dollar of additional income you get is matched by the credit until you reach the maximum amount. In the case of the EITC, as you mentioned, traditionally this is something that's been supported by both parties. Former President George W. Bush was a big advocate for the EITC, and it was expanded and protected during his administration. Similarly, President Obama and congressional Democrats have always been very supportive of it because it's, in addition to sort of encouraging people to move from welfare to work, it's also an incredibly powerful anti-poverty program. It's lifted millions and millions of people and families out of poverty. And that's why the Progressive Caucus has proposed not only maintaining existing spending for the EITC and the CTC, but also expanding them to cover more people, to do away with some of the unnecessary restrictions that limit eligibility.
Right. I mean, and, when we're talking about, lifting people out of poverty, again, this is just to kind of, make it so that, that squeeze that you were talking about, that sinking feeling at the end of the month that goes into the next month, that is less and less of a stress for families. And this isn't really about taking poor people and turning them into billionaires and millionaires. That's not what that's not what I see these policies doing. What I do find kind of interesting, especially as a health policy geek and nerd about this, I was really thrilled to see that the people's budget includes the public option and support for states to pursue single-payer health systems. What I was curious about, though, is that we already seem to have the Affordable Care Act in motion. So why do we need to add these? Why add the public option and single-payer into the mix?
Sure. So the Congressional Progressive Caucus, represents the most, the group of sort of the most progressive and forward-looking members in the House of Representatives and within the Democratic Party. They see it as their role to to push the envelope, to talk about bold, innovative solutions that maybe aren't, on the table today, but might be a part of the debate in the future. And that's kind of what they're doing here with the people's budget and with these particular health policies. So the CPC is always, every member of the CPC supported the Affordable Care Act, and obviously they will continue to defend it against attacks from folks in the Republican Party and elsewhere. But one of the things that the CPC believes is that if there are ways that we can expand choice for people, expand access to healthcare services, and also lower out-of-pocket costs and cost sharing for consumers, we should explore those options. And both with state single-payer systems and also with the public option, there's some real potential for doing that. One of the problems with having a healthcare system that's based on private health insurance is that you get a lot of waste built into that system, and you also have, because private health insurance companies and programs need to be profitable, they're also a little bit more expensive. That was the idea behind the public option: is you take the profit model out, you create a really efficient government-supported program, a nonprofit program, and that would be able to ideally compete effectively with some of these for-profit health insurance plans. Because you'd have increased competition, prices would come down, and it would be better for consumers everywhere. You get higher quality plans too. Increased competition provides that as well.
Right. Well, I was really impressed that the people's budget actually got the support of a majority of Democrats in the House. And so, but unfortunately, the House ended up adopting a very, very, very different budget. But, a lot of these policy provisions that you were just talking about, can they be adapted or inserted into other legislation that could be more appealing to the opposition?
No, absolutely. And that's one of the key pieces that members of the Progressive Caucus talk about when we're talking about the big, bold ideas that are included in the progressive budget. Particular, pieces that and provisions that are included in the budget have been pulled by allies on the outside and have been shown to be overwhelmingly popular. Let me give you a quick example. We have a provision in the Progressive Caucus budget that would allow the government to negotiate lower prescription drug prices by doing bulk procurement of drugs through the Medicare program. That's an idea that has over 79 of the American people support that idea.
Wow.
It's overwhelmingly popular. Another idea that's included is universal pre-kindergarten. That's something that the Progressive Caucus invested in the alternative budget, and 77% of the American people, both Democrats and Republicans, overwhelmingly support this idea. Similarly, ending tax loopholes for corporations that ship jobs overseas. 74% of the American people support that as a comprehensive way to raise some revenue to help make some of these key investments that we're talking about. So, there'll be a lot of opportunities to discuss tax policy this year, to discuss healthcare policy, to discuss some common sense ways in which we can improve the livelihood and opportunities for the American people. And the Progressive Caucus will be pushing these very popular, very bold ideas that could tangibly improve people's lives in each of those fights.
Well, I'd love to, I'd love to have our listeners, offer backup and support, for the members as they keep championing these ideas. Where can our listeners go on the internet to learn more and get involved and show their support?
Great. So the Congressional Progressive Caucus has a web page. It's cpc.grijalva, grijalva.house.gov. It's not the shortest and easiest web address to remember, but also if you just Google Congressional Progressive Caucus, it'll be the first thing that pops up.
Awesome.
If you go there, you can find out, in addition to information about all of the budgets the CPC has produced, you can find, some information about some other initiatives the caucus has been focusing on, including how to ensure that we have fair trade, how to ensure that we have peace and security around the world. Because the caucus is so diverse and works on so many issues, we've weighed in on a lot of the key issues that are being talked about in Washington.
Yeah, fantastic. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. This was really, really informative. I hope you guys definitely, at the very least, Google, Congressional Progressive Caucus. I think that there's so much there to, learn about and see that, our members of Congress do hear our voices. They do, turn them into policy, and they do fight for them. So, as much as it might feel and look like gloom and doom, you've got guys like Mike who are on your side, fighting for the American people. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Sanjeev, thanks again for having me, and good luck out there.
All right, thank you. Okay, folks, so, this episode kind of ends our first of a series that we're going to try to do on the Dr. America show here on the We Act Radio Network, and it's really to examine poverty in America. We're going to be calling it Dr. America versus the War on the Poor, and this is kind of part one. You got to kind of see how, the war on the poor seems to start in these places like the budget, which, might not seem all of that, fancy and glamorous and, dramatic, but you can tell, there's a lot there that, happens in the budget where, we're talking about, healthcare, food, housing, things that really do, make the world go round for millions of Americans. And this is just to, give us a shot at a decent life. It's not to give us a life, a shot at, obscene wealth or anything like that. And so I wanted to kind of start this series about the war on the poor by looking at, federal policy. And, in the coming episodes, we're going to be talking about things like, the minimum wage. We're going to be talking to people who are actually making it work in America, despite their situation with their paycheck. And we're going to kind of learn how do American families struggling with poverty actually get by? How do they make life tick? Because they're obviously not going anywhere. These are our fellow Americans. They are surviving, but we want to kind of get the conversation from, how are we going to go from just surviving to actually thriving? And there's a ton of health consequences involved with all of this. I see it all the time. I really, look forward to exploring that with you guys. And there's going to be some great conversations coming up. So I hope you guys stay tuned. Definitely check out our Facebook page. I want to thank, our guest, Mike Darner from the Congressional Progressive Caucus for, sharing what's an incredible piece of policy, the People's Budget. I want to thank you guys for hearing me out on guns, on laundry detergent, and bigotophilia. And again, I can't thank you guys enough for, staying tuned to the program, being active, engaged citizens, bringing your advocacy out to the streets. And yeah, let's do it again next week. I'm Dr. America signing off on the We Act Radio Network. I've been your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. Until next week, guys, salud to your health.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
If you're a veteran of Iraq or Afghanistan, like me, coming home can be harder than expected. But it turns out I wasn't alone. At IAVA.org, there's a free online community of thousands of vets who've got your back.
Whether it's managing the transition home
or everyday stuff like finding a nice sweater for my dog.
Sweater?
Okay, maybe not that. Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America is there for you. Join our community at IAVA.org.
We've got your back.
Brought to you by IAVA and the Ad Council.